Hey, what's up YouTube? This is Chuck, aka Basic Land Shark here. I'm going to be doing some Jund on Magic Online for your enjoyment. I hope you like the deck like I do. Let's go over it really quickly. We've got 23 lands in this version. A lot of people like 24, but I think with the addition of Wrenn and 6, 23 is just fine. We are going to use Ghost Quarter in this meta. Today is February the 8th of 2020. Crazy. But in this meta right now, I think Ghost Quarter is actually essential because there's a lot of Field of the Dead in this meta. There's also a lot of Valakut decks with Titan Shift and Amulet Titan decks on the rise. So Ghost Quarter is where we're at. 3 copies of Blackleaf Cliffs. Blackleaf Cliffs is great. We need red mana more than ever. We've got a couple of additional red cards in the list we're going to talk about here in a second. So 3 copies of Blackleaf Cliffs. You could run 4 if you would like. Maybe considering taking out the Ghost Quarter, but I think this is going to prove to be worth it. 1 copy of Blood Crypt is all you need. 4 copies of Bloodstained Mire. We're going to lean in that direction for our fetch. Black mana is just as important as red mana. 1 basic forest, 1 basic mountain. 1 copy of Nurturing Peatland. This is our cycling land of choice. Some decks run 2 copies of this. Some Jund decks run a split of Nurturing Peatland and cycling land such as Barrenmoor. If you're not familiar with those cards, they can be handy with Wrenn and 6 as well. But we're just going to run 1 and Ghost Quarter as our flex lands, if you will, for the deck. 2 copies of Overgrown Tomb, 1 copy of Raging Ravine. Jund decks in the past used to run 2 copies, even 3 copies of Raging Ravine, but Modern is a fast format, so 1 copy is where it's at right now. 1 Swamp, 4 copies of Verdant Catacombs for the same reason as the 4 copies of Bloodstained Mire. We're prioritizing black for Liliana, and we're prioritizing red for Wrenn and 6 and a bunch of other pesky threats. 2 copies of Wooded Foothills. This is just to round out the mana base and give us additional fetch lands. So we're running 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 fetch lands, right? A lot of people like to run less than that, 8, 9, but 10 fetch lands because Wrenn and 6 is that good with a fetch land in your opener. It's certainly what you want to see in your opener against a lot of matchups. So now, granted, Wrenn and 6 is not as great as it used to be. When it was first introduced, the card was a house, and it was just really, really hard for your opponent to come back from the value that it generates. Now, it's actually getting sideboarded out in a lot of decks, so I think 3 is the right number. A lot of Jund decks choose to run 4 in combination with Kroxa here, which we're going to talk about. I think that 3 is the correct number for Wrenn and 6, and it would probably take me a little while to come off that number. So less, I think you draw it too infrequently, and more, I think you draw it too often. So 3 is the right number for me. What is your testing? Let me know in the comments, and we'll try and decide and hash out the best list possible for the new meta, we'll call it. 2020 vision. All right, so moving on to the spells. We have a singleton copy of Fatal Push. A lot of Jund decks change around the numbers between how many Lightning Bolts and how many Fatal Push, depending on your local scene or what decks that you expect to face. Fatal Push goes up and down in value. So I'll admit this extirpate here, I'll pronounce it right, in the deck is just for the spiciness of, it's kind of like a gotcha card. So it has split second. We can exile a card other than a basic land in our opponent's graveyard. We get to search their hand, library as well, for all cards with the same name and exile them. Really happy about having this kind of effect in my deck, and it's sort of a gotcha card, like I was saying. As many as 4 copies in the past of Inquisition of Kozilek, but we're running 3 right now, in addition to 3 Thoughtseize. A lot of Jund decks switch these numbers around. Sometimes 4 Inquisition is where you want to be because the meta is so aggressive, and you don't want to be taking damage left and right from Thoughtseize off the top of your deck. But I think Thoughtseize is putting in more work right now than Inquisition overall. There's a lot of big mana decks. Like I was saying, Titan decks are a huge part of the format right now, so Thoughtseize does more work there. Inquisition just too good not to run. 4 copies of Lightning Bolt goes to what we were saying about Fatal Push, but Lightning Bolt still does the thing. Lightning Bolt deals 3 damage to any target. Really, really good when you're running Kroxa in your deck, and hopefully dealing them 6 in a turn in addition to a Lightning Bolt. That's 9 damage. Now, we're a Jund deck, so I think Jund is the best Tarmogoyf deck currently in Modern. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that. Jund is the best Tarmogoyf deck in Modern, and you're running 4 Tarmogoyfs. It would take me a whole heap of convincing that Tarmogoyf would be a bad card, even in the face of Rest in Peace and Graveyard Hate Spells. This is the card that makes your opponent bring those cards in against us, and might be something to consider as far as in the future. We have a lot of cards now that are dependent on the graveyard, so leaning more in that direction. I found room for 2 copies of Dark Confidant back in the list. I was running Seasoned Pyromancer originally alongside of Kroxa, and you know, I really want Dark Confidant in the list. Seasoned Pyromancer we cut. I guess we also cut Scavenging Ooze and moved it to the sideboard, so that's how we fit Dark Confidant back in the list. It's kind of a puzzle. Which one do you want to run? And I think right now we want to be on Tarmogoyf, Dark Confidant, Kroxa, and Wrenn and 6 is our 2 drops. That seems pretty sweet to me. So if you're not familiar with Dark Confidant, this card is a value engine. It must be dealt with by your opponent or it will run away with the game, and that's why it's in the list. It's perfect for what Jund wants to do. It's either kill this card or die to the card advantage that it provides for the player. So Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. This is a value card. Right now, Jund is kind of in flux, and there's a lot of new cards that got printed with Theros Beyond Death. Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. Legendary creature, Elder Giant. When Kroxa enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless it's escaped, right? So when it escapes, let me slow down. Whenever Kroxa enters the battlefield or attacks, each opponent discards a card. Then, each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life. So that's a little bit slow on its own, but 3 life is 3 life, and it goes, you know, it adds up with our Bolt plane. So it escapes for black, red, red. Exile 5 other cards from your graveyard. You may cast this card from your graveyard for its escape cost. If we go long, if games go long, then this is going to be a recursive threat our opponent has to deal with over and over and over again, unless they can path to exile or, you know, they find that Rest in Peace that we talked about. This card is going to be really, really hard to come back from just because of the recursion, and I think that's a neat aspect to have laying around in a Jund deck. So we're going to be leaning into the graveyard a little bit more, like I said. It makes Grave Hate a little bit better against us when you run Kroxa. That's something to consider. That's why we cut the Seasoned Pyromancers out and put the Dark Confidants in, so we get that card advantage first. And that's kind of where my head's at with this card in particular. So Assassin's Trophy, a lot of people suggested that this card is not to be run in too many copies because giving your opponent's land is really, really high impact and can actually swing the game in certain matchups. Like I was saying before, Titan is really, really good right now. Titan decks, if you give them a land, they're going to find something to do with it, and it's just going to mean that Field of the Dead is turned on that much quicker. So I do like the versatility that Assassin's Trophy offers. I think that it's worth playing. Maybe even could find room for another copy somewhere in the main deck if we try hard enough. But I completely cut Terminate and replaced it with Abrupt Decay. The last time that I played in a league, I did very poorly with Terminate in the deck, and I just found that the number of times that I wished that that Terminate was an Abrupt Decay or an Assassin's Trophy was too high. So now we're on Abrupt Decay in that spot, and we're going to try that out, at least for the foreseeable future. We have the full 4 copies of Liliana the Veil. This is definitely where you want to be in Jund. Ideal turns start with a discard spell, either Inquisition or Thoughtseize, into a Tarmogoyf or a Dark Confidant, into a Liliana. So read this card, you'll understand why it's in the deck. It's just everything. It represents everything that Jund wants to do. Another card like that is Kolaghan's Command. This is definitely the modern type of card that I enjoy playing. So Very interactive. You have a lot of modes. It's never dead. This card I'm always excited to have in my hand in some way, shape, or form. It's just too modal. It just does way too much for too little. And it's costed perfectly, so you can get it off a Bloodbraid Elf. It's just instant, so it's good at most spots in the game. Can't say enough great words about Kolaghan's Command. I think I'm in love with this card, you guys. So Maelstrom Pulse, this card is a little bit of a clunker sometimes. It's a little slow. It's usually a great hit off of Bloodbraid Elf when your opponent has something of value on the battlefield. And it's a great way to mop up the board against Empty the Warrens, Goblins, Tokens, things of that nature. And it's just versatile. You can pick off an opposing 3 mana Teferi or whatever it needs to be, Planeswalkers sometimes. Your opponent's sideboard hate, whatever. This card is just a catch-all. And Bloodbraid Elf. So this card got unbanned. Awesome. You get to cascade into your 3-drops. Everything is a hit off of Bloodbraid Elf. And I forgot to mention, we have a singleton copy of Liliana Lasthope. I'm seeing right now more and more green-white combo with the Heliod and Walking Ballista combo in there, in addition to Devoted Druid and Vizier of Remedies combo. So Liliana the Last Hope is pretty good against those decks, and it's also good against other decks, but I'm actually going to have this copy in the main deck to try and hedge against that matchup a little bit. I think it's good enough against other matchups where it should prove to serve its role nicely as a one-of. Moving on to the sideboard here. Sideboard is always in flux, and my sideboard configuration may look totally different than yours, and that's perfectly fine because you want to be keeping in mind what meta that you're expecting to face and what decks you're expecting to concede to, because you only have 15 slots here, and that's not really enough to go around in Modern, and really hasn't been for a while. So with that said, the decks that we're expecting to face are the decks that we're expecting to face are big mana decks and decks that want to abuse the graveyard. I guess we'll concede to the artifact matchups. If Affinity is still rearing its presence, then we're not going to have a good game plan against that, and we don't have a whole bunch of cards that deal with those type of strategies. Alpine Moon, I think, is the card that we're going to run over Fulminator Mage. This card's quicker, and it does what we need to against Field of the Dead, and I guess we could use this against Eldrazi Tron, naming one of their Tron lands, or Eldrazi Temple. It's pretty versatile in that regard. Name the card that it hits. Speaking of Alpine Moon, I know a lot of Jund decks right now are leaning in the direction of running Blood Moon. I intend to try that at some point, but I am not 100% sure that it's a wise idea to turn Jund into a Blood Moon deck. I've seen it done quite a few times, and I don't know. I feel like if you're going to run Blood Moon in Jund, you may as well just be a Ponza deck or something like that. That's kind of my initial thoughts on that, but I haven't tried it for myself, so that's what I'm basing it on. It's just what I've seen. Grafdigger's Cage. This card's really good against Collected Company decks and comes in against Dredge. Damping Sphere. This is just too good not to play. It's splash hate against Tron. It's splash hate against Alien. It's splash hate against Storm. You get the idea. It's just got a lot of overlap, and that's the kind of thing you want out of your sideboard card. This is pretty controversial here, but I'm running 2 copies of Scavenging Ooze in the sideboard. Lately, I have not been super impressed with Scavenging Ooze in my openers and my opening hand, meaning Scavenging Ooze, I think we're going to relegate this to the sideboard for now until graveyard decks become that much of a threat again. The life gain is also something to keep in mind, so this is a card I would certainly bring in against Burn. We do not have a whole bunch of life gain in the deck, and that could prove to be bad. So I think we're going to be a little bit hedging that we don't face Burn too much. Collective Brutality, this is another card I would bring in against Burn. Never have I run this in the main deck in Jund, but I think that Scavenging Ooze and Collective Brutality makes a nice package against aggressive decks with a lot of fast creatures and fast starts. So Ashiok, this is another card that hates on the graveyard. It also turns off our opponent's ability to search their library. So this is probably the best card that we have against the Eldrazi Tron and Amulet Titan decks. So Ashiok in a large number. This is 3 copies here, I think, is where we're going to be. We may even cut Liliana Last Hope in those matchups, and I think Lightning Bolt is pretty bad in those big mana matchups, is what I'm hearing. So those should be pretty easy to cut. We're going to run Choke if we run into control. Pretty much islands don't untap during their controller's untap steps, and that's pretty significant for any kind of deck that's leaning on Cryptic Command, I guess, is where we'd want to bring this in. Although it's not as relevant as it used to be, because there's a lot of Sulfur Falls and other, Spire Bluff Canal kind of blue decks that are out there as well. Thinking of Storm here. Anger of the Gods, this is for Dredge and any kind of like fast aggressive or tribal strategies, decks that want to flood the board out with creatures that synergize. We're just going to anger that all away. And Plague Engineer, this is for tribal. So Plague Engineer, one of the better cards in my opinion printed out of Modern Horizons, really was kind of a sleeper at first. I even remember selling one of my attempting to sell one of my copies, and the shop wasn't interested in it. But the card actually puts in work. It's Death Touch 2/2. As it enters the battlefield, choose any creature type. That's the kind of versatility that you want. And creatures of that type get -1/-1, so you can either sweep the board, or it's even good in the mirror. If our opponent's playing opposing Tarmogoyfs, we can shrink theirs down to a 4/5, and ours may be a 5/6 because it's only their creatures. Hopefully you guys are satisfied with the deck tech. If there's anything that I missed, or if there's any cards that are just too good or too bad to be playing or not to play, let me know in the comments down below. And again, for those that don't know, this is Chuck, aka Basic Land Shark, signing off. Have a great day.